Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CMA and CMO Weekly Webinar Series. I'm Jackie Lewis, VP of Content here at the CMA, and I will be your host for today's webinar. With trends like online ordering and physical store fulfillment continuing, more and more retailers are investing or have already developed and deployed in-house AI solutions to better leverage their data. And so in this webinar, we're going to explore 4 use cases on how AI is being used to help drive smart cluster strategies, store-specific SKUs, fast planogram creation, and better store planning overall. So presenting today from HIVERY is Dirk Herdes, VP of Retail, an experienced professional services executive helping retail and CPG connect the dots between data and analytics to drive smarter execution. We're also thrilled to be joined by Flora Delaney, an experienced retail and CPG executive who helps companies achieve their objectives through strategic initiatives. She is actually also the lead facilitator of the Retail Space Planning Charter created by ARC, and so I have the pleasure of working with her regularly and are just thrilled to have her joining us on the webinar today. So as you have any questions for Dirk or Flora throughout the presentation, just feel free to enter those in the chat box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen at any time. And finally, we will be sharing the recording with registrants after today's webinar with all CMA and CMA members. We'll be posting in our resource library, so don't worry if you missed something, you'll be able to follow up with the video. So with all of that out of the way, welcome Dirk and Flora again. Great to have you here, and I will hand it over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jackie. Appreciate the continued partnership with CMA and for the opportunity to kind of have the discussion today. So as you said, kind of what we're going to discuss really is just this idea of really how do we leverage new tools, new technologies, and what impact does that have on retail space planning? I'm thrilled to be here. I appreciate everyone kind of taking time out of their calendars to join us today in what is really intended to be a discussion. It's not often that I get the chance to talk about something that I'm personally very passionate about with someone like Flora, who has such deep industry expertise and knowledge on this. So I'm equally, as a panelist, eager to learn from her as we go through this today. So Flora, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no, I've been looking forward to this all week. I know that this is going to be interesting. I'm sure we're all going to learn a little bit of something, and we'll all be challenged. I know I plan to challenge you.
I'm sure. I expect to. From an agenda standpoint, as Jackie said, so really just kind of 2 core themes. First, just what's kind of going on in the industry, and kind of why is that creating challenges that are raising this need. But then what does that mean, right, from an opportunity standpoint? And then from an opportunity standpoint, really got to dive into that specifically around shelf planning and around assortment, and in 4 key areas. So talking a bit about how we deal with this today and what do new tools and technologies open up for us in the future. So we'll talk about localized planning, right? Community stores, and what does that mean, and how can I execute on that? We'll talk about effective merchandising at scale, right? It's great to understand what I should carry, but at the end of the day, I have constraints at the store level. I have strategies I'm trying to execute. How do I do that at scale and still be ready to kind of get to my stores? And then we'll talk about operational efficiency, both from a centralized standpoint, so the teams that manage the analytics through to the teams in the stores, and actually how they execute downstream. And then lastly, anybody knows anything about this area, it's a highly collaborative process, highly iterative. And so how do tools allow us to actually make decisions faster together with greater transparency and really put data at the forefront of that? And then, as Jackie said, we'll open it up at the end for Q&A. So feel free to fire away with your questions in the chat as we go through this, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the time that we have allotted. So let's start with the challenge. Flora, I'm going to kind of start to talk through a few different areas. I'm really eager to kind of get your perspective as well and what you're seeing from some of your customers and just the industry at large. You had shared a quote, I think, just recently, or a statement, had done a survey in Q1. And out of those retailers, the top kind of technology trend or thing they were looking at was store-specific assortment and planogram. And so over even some other new technologies, VR, automation, et cetera, and why is kind of driving that. I have a little quote up here. It's something that if you've played sports, we always got talked to a lot. What got you here today won't get you to where you need to be in the future. And so what are some of the things that we're seeing that are driving that? So the first one, omnichannel, right? I think, had you joined a webinar maybe 5-7 years ago, you might have seen a chart saying the future of stores is dead, they'll be declining. I think obviously that is far from the truth. Actually in 2021, we saw store sales outpace online sales, but neither is going away, right? Omnichannel is just putting a lot more pressure on stores, both how do I digitize that experience, right, in the stores, operationally, right? I've got pickers in stores. I've got to think about the back room, the shelf, how do these things play together? And then just customers' expectations. Consumers are changing, right? As they have digital tools, personalization. What does that mean, right, when I'm in a store? So I think this is clearly one that's putting a lot of pressure on retailers and their suppliers from an operational standpoint. I don't know if there's anything you would add on this one.
Well, I mean, I think that absolutely in the last 2 to 3 years, this idea of buy online, pick up in store, professional shoppers who are picking orders are putting incredible pressures on, you say retailers, I'd say space planning teams. They really have different inputs now than they ever had before, and they're really trying to figure out how do they include that, what does it mean for merchandise presentation and the way they expect the stores to look, and how do they make it, as you said, as operationally efficient as possible, because there's a whole new way to think about your shelves when you're thinking about stores as micro fulfillment centers, as opposed to a place where shoppers come and browse, right?
Yeah, and we'll talk a lot about that operational cost, right? Because the other challenge I think we're seeing, right, is I'm adding all these new services for my customers, but ultimately the cost of the goods is the same, and so it's putting pressure on margins and creating a need for greater efficiency. I'm going to bring up these next two at the same time because I think they play so hand in hand, right? Change is a constant, we all know that, but I do think the thing that's happening a lot more is change is happening more rapidly, right? So whether it's inflation, at the same time we're worried about a recession, so you have consumers kind of shifting between pack sizes to value packs to own brands, and that's happening differently, right, in different stores, in different communities, and even in different categories. Labor shortages, right, putting increased pressure on me as a retailer, going back to that idea, Flora, right, like, hey, how do I make sure that this is as efficient as possible because I have less people in the store and I have higher costs just all the way through kind of that supply chain from distribution center all the way down to the ultimate, what does the shelf need to deliver? So it's just putting a lot of pressure to who responds faster, but also who can maximize their ROI and using precision planning to kind of get there. So I think that's another thing that's driving a lot of pressure and kind of shift to why store specific? Why is that a consideration for us in the future?
Yeah, I think a lot of times now that retailers can see what they knew in their heart was true, which was stores and customer demand and neighborhood demand is different. But once they started seeing those online orders come through, they could really actually see how different their stores were from one another. They're starting to realize that maybe the assortments, the way that they were trying to target them by cluster, what have you, weren't quite right. They got to get closer to the customer. And then when you say market shocks, I think what I think about is how fast they've been asked to react and iterate. You don't know what's happening. You don't know, even with the best planning, how quickly you're going to have to pull something off the shelf, replace it with something else, whether or not your own brand and private label items are going to come in as you planned. And so it feels like there's a lot more emergency changes coming through that's disrupting what would be the normal planning cycles for most retailers.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll talk about kind of what do new tools open up for us for when thinking about that reset process, right? What could be different and how could we respond differently and faster? And this last one, certainly not a new trend, right? But I think just the rise of data monetization. And when I think about monetization, what I mean by this is the role of data in making decisions within my organization and the external value it creates. I think retailers have really seen just how valuable this asset is, but it's kind of different levels of maturity, right? And my integrity of data, the quality, it's pushing change management in my organization, thinking differently about the role of technology and tools and when I manage my data and then how I democratize that across my own organization, but also how I interact with, right, suppliers. How can I actually make sure that I'm maximizing that value of my data in my own decision making and then how I externalize that as well. I think it's another one that's just rounding out and putting that different pressure on the business.
Yeah, I like what you said, democratizing data, because I do see that as a trend happening in a lot of the clients that I'm interacting with, where data used to kind of be kept in a silo, and there were these data scientists and business analysts and people with the right tools. You'd go beg them for a report. They'd go up to the mountain, they'd make the report, they'd come down with the tablets. And now I don't see retailers doing that as much. I see them much more trying to say, we're going to make sure this data is accessible to everyone, put the tools closer into the hands of the people who need to make decisions.
Absolutely. And so for us, when we think about, what does this mean? Really, for us, I think it's the winners of the future will be the ones that can kind of make that transition as efficiently as possible, as effectively as possible, from a model that was really around control and standardization. Just using the data example you shared, right? That was kind of traditional. I want to control it. I want to create efficiencies and standardization. That was the goal. That was the objective, right? To really, in the future, how do I balance some central governance around those things, but really enable more agility at the edge? And so we'll talk about what that means at a store level and at a planning level. How do I give that flexibility while still being consistent with my governance? With that, I'm going to kind of tee you up here. I know you're leading an effort in partnership with ARC and CMA around space planning charter. So just would love to kind of get some thoughts on what you're seeing, what you're hearing, and where you guys are focused in this effort.
Sure. One of the things that retailers have never had is a industry association for the professionals who work in space planning. If you ever brought space planning people together, it was around a specific solution because you went to a user conference. And as we started talking a few years ago, we created a retailer space summit. It happened once a year, but you can't really get a lot of traction when you only come together once a year. And so ARC really helped underwrite this bringing together of all different retailers into the space planning charter. There's a URL here, spaceplanning.global. If you're a retailer and you're on this call and you think you might be interested in learning what we're doing, I'd really recommend that you go there. But really what we did was we brought together about 10 retailers right now. We're growing every single meeting. We have a new retailer joining us, and we're coalescing around some specific things that are saying these are the things we most need to grapple with. And one is talent, not just like how do I attract and retain talent, because space planning tends to be an entry-level position often for retailers, and then your best and brightest get moved into buying or merchandising or ops or somewhere else. And so you're constantly bringing people in, but also just a real realization that the skill sets that we have in space planning today are not the skill sets we're probably going to need in space planning in the future. So how do we build new sense abilities? How do we get new skills, soft skills, hard skills, all of that to try to grow our talent? The next is metrics and insights. And boy, that's a really big thing because every retailer feels like they have to figure that out on their own. What
Sure.
does good look like? What is a good scorecard? What should I be measuring? What should a pre and post planogram reset deliver? All of that we're trying to come together and really identify best practices. And then of course, how do we start to coalesce around what are processes that all retailers do? They may have their own secret sauce, but they all kind of do the same thing, whether it's doing regular category reviews that lead to resets, whether there are emergency swap outs that they're doing, and then just how do they start to work on processes in the store that feed back to executional compliance that they can kind of understand how they're doing. So all of that is coming together, and I think it's exciting work, it's new work, and it's the kind of industry best practices that you'll see in like the Professional Pricing Society or a supply chain association, but there's never been anything for space planning. And so I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I love to see that. I mean, at the end of the day, right, I have to execute this stuff. I have to make sure that the insights I have can be executed. And this is where that happens. And so to see the focus and the investment, I think is a big win. I'm going to dive in a little bit these next few slides. You talked about talent. And I think that's a really important point, right? And so as new tools come along, what does that mean from today and how we work into the future? What does that impact on the people and how they're kind of working? And so if we think about tools today, we tend to operate with aggregated insights, trends and information, because it's easier to kind of work with that aggregated information. We think of things like localization, lots of future capability. The tools that we use tend to reward really good skill with that tool, as opposed to really good skill about what's my business, what are my objectives, and really strategic thinking. And you mentioned process, right? They tend to focus on incremental gains in that process, as opposed to, wait, how do we make sure your goals are being met? And then we fit within whatever that process is, as opposed to having to fit within the tool process and the way that we've done it in the past. And so when we look at what is the future, okay, we think it's granular data is actionable data. So it's going to be built from the granular data up. And we'll talk about what that means from like space aware and localization. It's outcome driven, right? So it puts the power of AI in my hands to run rapid simulations and actually quantify what is the decision before I actually do it. The old adage of measure twice, cut once. It'll be prescriptive and iterative in nature, right? So it's about, am I asking the right questions? And I can actually iterate through that process. And then really about ease of use across the organization, right? So it's not about, am I good at this tool, but am I good at what I'm trying to solve with that space challenge? And it does impact talent, right? It impacts the, how do I teach, how do I train, and what does that future role look like? And if we build that in a little bit, from an analytics standpoint, we'll dive into this a bit and would love kind of your perspective or what you're seeing as you talk to the retailers today. Right, from an analytics standpoint, what does that mean on a journey? And so when we combine AI, which machine learning, predictive analytics with decision optimization, how does that change the role of people in the process? And so we do 1 and 2, I would say, relatively well today. Everybody's pretty good at predictive, right? I've got the data, I can look back and see what's happening, but there's still a lot of emphasis on me as a user then to manually go fit that into execution at the shelf, right? And so a lot of effort to kind of go from what am I seeing to what actually should I do to execute, make decisions, and action. Starting to see a little bit of introduction into predictive. So now building a forecast, a demand profile off of that data, but I still have to be the one to go, okay, well, based upon that prediction, how do I actually make that work physically, and then make the decisions that have to happen? What we get excited about is the integration of these two things together, right? So now I get prescriptive. I can start to interact with it. What should I do? Give me directions, give me informative kind of things, but then also adaptive, right? Moving away from the model of I just feed all the data in and it spits out, here's your recommendation. There's certain things the data doesn't know that I need to interact with, but it allows the human to spend much more time in that strategic thinking space and then automating the execution. And so how do we drive that journey specifically within space planning?
Well, I understand this. I get it all. I guess what I'm thinking about is that this seems like kind of a continuum, 1 through analytics 1.0, 4.0. In reality, do you actually have retailers that that are working in analytics 4.0, or is that still sort of that's the vision of where we want to be? Because I'm not sure I've seen that necessarily.
Yeah, I think in different areas. Certainly, I don't think we're seeing it in the space or the assortment stage just yet. I think the tools and technologies are just now coming online that allow us to do this. So I think really good in predictive. I think in looking back, descriptive. And we're seeing more and more in the prescriptive, but the next stage, still a journey, I think, for a lot of places. It's still a very manual process today, right? And so how do I take that journey as an organization, for sure?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, if you look at their space planning system as it was implemented, whenever they implemented it, what they feed into it today tends to be descriptive. What happened? What were the sales? And usually it's averaged across some store grouping. So it's not even necessarily at the store specific level. And then maybe they're getting to predictive forecasts, customer demands. And I think where a lot of folks would like to get to is sort of like, I'd like to look at different scenarios. I'd like to see what would happen if I did something. So that feels like prescriptive, maybe. I'm not even sure that we've got folks dabbling on the edge of 4.0 just yet.
For sure, yeah, and I think that's kind of part of the journey, that we're trying to drive. And what does that actually mean to space? And so now let's dig into those kind of 4 ideas, right? How would I actually leverage these new tools to deliver dynamic, we'll talk about this, strategic aware merchandising plans? So how do I use that bottoms up? And we'll talk about locally relevant, right? So how do I do it at a localized level? You mentioned, right, aggregate data sets. These new tools allow us to get down to, right, the most granular data and really understand our customer behavior and how our stores are working. Effectively merchandised, operationally efficient, and then transparent collaboration. So I'm going to go first into locally relevant. And want to have a bit of a discussion here. Here's what we're seeing. I'd love to know if you kind of hearing, seeing the same thing as far as how we think about locally relevant today. A lot of this is very much driven by operational constraints and resource capacity. It tends to be how I think about it, right? The level of localization is really dependent upon the resourcing that I have to get there. And so we see a lot of clustering. Makes sense. We're seeing some refinement and some growth in this space. Tends to be maybe it's geographic or historical norms, often informed by aggregated insights, right? Demographics could be external information, attitudinal behavior about my categories. And then those that I think are getting it down to execution, or at least taking it down to space, right? So I have a 4-foot space, an 8-foot space. And, so this is stepping in that right direction, I think, of localization, but we still see, a lot of inefficiencies once you get down to how individual stores perform. And then on the resource side, really that whole, the way I actually turn that into planograms is still highly manual. And so my ability to go local is strictly tied to the amount of resources that I have, right? And so how do I start to free that up? And then also my timing, right? It's very capacity driven. Most categories go through once I have the capacity of people to do that. And we tend to think about all or nothing, right? I manage all stores as opposed to what if I have an opportunity in a subset? And that's a better, investment. And so how do I start to bring that to life?
For sure. Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, when I look at cluster approach, I think you're right on the first dot point. I see a lot of retailers, of course, they're doing their Eastern region versus their Midwest versus their West, of course, or maybe they go tighter, Detroit versus Indianapolis or something. And they do the last dot point, the 4-foot set, the 8-foot set, the 72-inch tall, 68-inch tall. Whether or not they get that middle dot point included in their clusters depends a little bit on how sophisticated that particular buyer and supplier and other folks are and how much it matters, because it may definitely matter in things like, I don't know, condiments or something, and not matter nearly as much in paper products. So I think there's always some level of cluster because they're not sending out an 8-foot set to 4-foot stores. So there's that idea of a cluster.
Sure.
But certainly on the resource capacity side, most retailers are, if they're doing a category, they're doing that category across all stores. And if only a small fraction of the stores would actually drive value by conducting the reset, it doesn't matter. All the stores are going to get the reset, even if it's just a small fraction that are really going to have some big changes that will drive their business. It's just a matter of how their category planning process works. They are not able to isolate on just which stores are going to matter and leave the rest. They just really can't operationalize that. And so you're right, it's kind of this all or nothing approach.
Yeah, and so what does it look like in practice? This is an example where with one of our clients that we worked with, obviously appropriately masked, but on the left is kind of their historical approach, right? We'll talk about geographic alignments, some clusters built around space, and we saw opportunities, right? They saw about a 3.5% growth in assortment optimization. You saw some opportunities in certain regions and certain growth areas, but they wanted to know what actually is the opportunity if I went more granular. Because the reality of it is people don't shop that way, right? If I'm shopping in Northeastern New York, I'm shopping in Northeastern New York. I don't really care about what's happening in Western New York. And you also mentioned, I just don't know what it's worth. And this is really where AI and quantification becomes really important. Now we can tell you, well, actually, if you were to go down to store level, the opportunity is 7.5% growth. Now, that may not be the right decision, but I now know what it's worth to me and what the operational costs may be. And we also quickly see that not all stores are created equal. And so what we landed on with them was, actually, if we just go store specific in the top 20% of your stores, we can realize nearly 40% of that growth just in those stores, and then we can recluster the rest. And so simply by only drawing about 50 more total planograms, which again are getting automated, they were able to get to about 5.5% growth and start on that process of really getting more localized and taking advantage of where they have opportunities in individual stores, as well as still refining my clusters. And so there's a way to kind of find that balance and leverage these tools to identify where that's at.
Yeah, when I think about clusters, I mean, let's say you had a chain and you were doing everything at the chain level. And then you were like, you know what, I'm going to go down and I've identified 4 clusters. Okay, well, that's great. And in my world, 25% of my stores belong to each cluster. That's great. You're being a little bit more focused, but within each cluster, there's still going to be extremities. There's still going to be low volume stores and high volume stores in each cluster. And even when you start to cluster, you're still looking at an average or something across that whole chain, which sub-optimizes each individual store, which I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how, okay, great. I know that's not great, but how do I get to that next level? Do I actually have to go to store specific, or is there some way for me to understand what would I get out of going from 4 clusters to 8? Is it twice better? Is it, 2 times the work, but only 20% of the value? Like, how do I figure out what that means?
Yeah, and it's a kind of a segue into this idea of effective merchandise. I also have to know what's it worth to me, and also is it executable, right? Because I've got to get faster at how I turn that into planograms. And I know we're going to hit on one of your favorite topics here, the term of space aware. So when we think about that idea, right, of effectively merchandised, for us, that means I have to really understand 2 things. I have to be strategy aware. This old adage of I just feed the data and the AI tells me what I'm going to do, it doesn't work, right? It is an iterative process. There are certain things that as a business I want to achieve that simply the data doesn't know, right? And so we need to equip people with the ability to we talk it AI co-pilot, right? Give them a co-pilot along that journey. How do I ask questions and then quantify those impacts much earlier in the process, right? How do I bring space much earlier into the discussion? So it could be, we just talked about what is my localization strategy? How do I actually quantify that, right? Is it 10 clusters? Is it 6 clusters? Is it 20 clusters? Is it store specific? How do we give people the data to make that decision, right? What's that balance between operational efficiency and revenue growth? Maybe I've got a new initiative around shelf-ready packaging. Great. How is that going to impact my store assortment? How's that going to impact my sales? And so giving them kind of the simulation capability to run those in real time, get those insights, and now it allows me to make those decisions much earlier in the process and then guide kind of the space planning downstream and really drive a lot of efficiencies. But it really depends on how you build it and kind of getting to that space aware piece of it.
Okay, well, 2 things. First of all, I'm really thrilled that you are recognizing that, space and assortment and these decisions are iterative. They're circular, they're referential. They're not like in a chevron and you start here and you end here and that's what you do. It never works that way. There's constantly communication back and forth between the retailer and its suppliers, between the space planning team and the category managers, between the category managers and the execution team. So it is referential. So I'm glad to see that. And I think that in the future, as retailers move to their future process, it has to be this way, because to say it starts with 1 and it ends in 5 and you go straight in a row, it just isn't how the process works. So I'm glad to see that. But second, you're right. I do have a pet peeve with the word space aware, because it's like the hottest thing every assortment solution out there is saying is, oh yeah, we're a space aware assortment. And I just go, yeah, well, what does that mean? Because for some folks, it just means that they count the linear space and they say, well, we know how much linear footage this category takes up. And that is not space aware, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I love the call. We'll kind of talk about what it means to us and tie it back. Look, if I'm in space planning, at the end of the day, this has to arrive on a shelf. It has to look right, has to be aesthetically pleasing, has to be merchandised correctly. And if I'm going to leverage automation and AI, space aware and what that means becomes really important, right? So for us, you always start with the goal in mind. What is it, the objectives, financially, operationally, I'm trying to drive? And what inputs do I need to be space aware to get there? And it comes back to that idea of granularity. So first off, we have to know about the space. So not just linear footage, we have to know the depth of the shelf, the fixture types, the styles that you're talking. Is it ambient? Is it cool? And you have to know that in every store, right? Because there will be certain uniquenesses. We've seen you've acquired those stores over time. The layout, it never is the same across every store. So you have to start with the granularity of space. Then the same granularity on sales. What is actually happening in that store? What are some of the trends that are driving that, and how are items performing? I have to know how those items are interacting with each other, right? So if I pull one item off, do those 2 items grab the sales? Does the sales leave the category, right? So I need to understand demand transfer as I'm doing the optimization. but I also need to understand the assortment constraints. So what are the product dimensions? What are the merchandising styles? Can it be forward facing? Can it be on its side? Can it be on the top shelf, the bottom shelf? What about flow and adjacencies? What about DC requirements? Do I have enough slots for that item to be there? When we talk about space aware, this is a hard problem to solve, right? This is why new technologies and tools are so necessary to do this. The reason we manually draw this today is that's the only way I can consider all of these things and still see how it fits. With new tools, when we think of space aware, it's how do I optimize against all of these so I can actually deliver the financial forecast and optimize and automate the planogram process to get it further down that line.
I think it's interesting that you're saying automate this process, because when I look at this page, what I see is this is what I expect my planogrammers to be doing when they get the assortment and they're staring at those shelves and now they have to merchandise. It's like they have to do all this in their head and figure this out. And we might give them information on the side or in a ribbon on the bottom or when they hover to help them make all these decisions. But these are all the different elements they're sort of expected to balance and optimize like the human being. And that's why some planogrammers do it really well and some don't, because this is super complicated.
Yeah, and what is the impact of my decisions, right? How's that going to impact category sales? Is it still aligned with my strategy? Right. So it's just, it's a highly complex.
Yeah, they may never even get to the point where they've got the time to start thinking like that. They're just trying to get it all to fit, right? And to actually then go back and review it and have the time to say, so what did I do? What is this going to get me? Very rarely is there even time built in the process to do that.
Yeah, it's usually a dead sprint, right? Of like, I've got these 12, 13 weeks and I'm just trying to get to delivery on time, right? Let alone what it actually does to the business.
Exactly.
And so how do we kind of create efficiency? Like, let's talk about that at the headquarter level. I'm gonna hit this quickly, but you mentioned it, right? Like we treat it as this episodic process. I start on the left, I've got metrics, goals, financial objectives, strategic objectives, and I'm trying to get to the right. This is the assortment I need. This is the planograms I'm gonna go kick off into the store, and this is the financial forecast of that business. For most, it's a 4 to 6 month process, 150 different steps involved in that, lots of different people involved. And so the opportunity is, how do I create efficiencies within that process? How do I reduce that window down, right? What if I transform the way I think about it, right? I have speed and precision. I have the ability to use automation to kind of accelerate that. It allows us to start to think differently about the reset process while not changing the starting point and the end goal, right? I'm still starting with these inputs and I'm still trying to arrive at this execution. But the tools and technology give us the chance to really start to drive efficiencies at a centralized level. How do I analyze faster? How do I quantify the impact of that? And then how do I get it into execution?
Yeah, I think there's some retailers out there who would envy having a 4 to 6 month process. I think there's some that don't have even longer processes. It's necessarily complicated because there's so many touch points and so many different functions that need to be aligned and steps that need to happen so that you can make sure you execute. It's why fundamentally I think people need to reevaluate their process and say you're not going to be able to take today's process and somehow think you can compress it and just go really faster in this process. I think fundamentally retailers have to reevaluate how they're doing everything from their category reviews to their execution, and how do they change how they're doing, what they're doing, when they're doing it, who is doing it, so that they can go faster, because they'll never get there in today's current tool set and processes.
And I love that you said, like, just rethinking about the process. If anybody tells you I can automate this soup to nuts, the bottom line is it doesn't work that way. You got product development, you got just many, many iterations of things. But how do I look at my process and find windows of efficiencies, windows of gains that then, as I accumulate those together, that's where I start to see the benefits. You hit on this one earlier. This has been one of the funnest things for me as we've gotten into this space and really worked. Instead of thinking about range and variation of products, the biggest value in store specific and really starting to get deeper is even with the best clusters, not all stores operate the same, right? I've got certain stores that turn really fast, certain stores that turn really low. The example on the right we've got here is this particular item, in store A, it's way overstocked. It doesn't sell well in that store, but it's all in the same cluster. So it's being assigned the 6.5 days of supply. So I'm creating challenges. It's going to waste. I have to take it off the shelf. It's labor in the store. In store B, in the same cluster, it's turning too fast. I can't keep it in stock. Do I have the right order frequency? And so you really start to see, when you get at this granular level of data, the operational opportunities to downstream impact, right? Through better planning, I can actually be much more efficient with my store. But it starts at the planning phase, right? I've really got to get it right at the planning phase. And so how do I use this data to make those decisions, right?
Yeah. And executives right now are all talking about how to reduce costs, right? People are being let go, things are getting downsized. Like, how do I hold down costs? And, you know, you look at the operational costs that are created when you have to restock and touch those shelves. All those store tasks times the number of stores means you're creating a lot of work if you don't get this plan right. You can get this plan right, and all of a sudden you've got shelves that meet customer demand, and you can start to hold back on the costs of just staying in business.
Yeah, and one example we loved on this, right, was when you use tools like this, it also opens up new capabilities, right? When I understand that total space environment, total sales environment, now with simple rules, simple constraints, I can also start to reduce waste by aligning that sales rate to my shelf life, right? So it just opens up new capabilities that have big impacts on the business, whether that's food waste, labor costs. So it's about shifting the way that we think about this and just opening up. And you said it earlier, right? With talent, like the skills we have today, there's a massive opportunity for the folks in virtual or visual merchandising in space, whatever term, to have major, major impacts on the business if we give them the right tools and assets to drive that.
Yes.
But
yeah, you know, I don't think people think about perishable foods and expiration dates and things that much when they're working in planogramming. It is actually kind of rare, other than maybe dairy and a few other areas, to even work in perishable foods that have expiration dates. But that's an important piece, especially if you ever get to a point where you're going to start planogramming things like packaged salads, fresh herbs, all those things that have really tight expiration dates.
Yeah. And so we hit on this before, but I do want to drive it home. What does it actually mean to be iterative and actually collaborate? Look, anybody that's been involved in merchandise planning, you said it well, it's an incredibly collaborative process. It's very dynamic, right? Each decision has another impact on this decision. And it's very iterative, right? There's a late change from a supplier. I can't get the product to you anymore. I've got a new innovation I want to add to the store. There are so many things coming at you, and so many pieces, disparate data sets, silos in the organization. What using data, using tools allow you to do is actually bring a more end-to-end view, right? So even when I'm doing strategy, I should be aware of the space constraints. And when I'm doing assortment, I should be aware of the impact on the space constraints, right? It's no longer okay. It's not effective to just wait until the very end and then try to hammer all that together and figure out how it fits on the shelf. And I need to be able to iterate, right? Last minute, new change, I got a question. And so how do we give them the data to say, okay, well, what is the impact of that, so that we can make decisions faster, and I think with a lot more confidence, right? Because the knowledge that exists in retail is profound. These people know their business. They know what the goals of the category are, but we're not equipping them with the data in that simulation stage to really make those decisions, right? It's just kind of, well, here's what I want to do, and let's see what happens, when I get to the end.
Yeah, retail is just like a never-ending experiment, right? You're just you're throwing it out there, you're seeing what it did, and then you adjust, you see it, throw it out there again. And if there were actually a way to get a better sense of what will happen before you actually have to commit to buying that product, to setting the stores, to all that labor, it would be amazing.
Yeah, and so hopefully here's where we see this happen in the future. This is an example of one of our customers, right? These are all things that I may have thought about, right? But I never had the data to see how each one would impact me, right? These are all questions that I might ask, right? Okay, if I just look at my assortment, what's the opportunity? Now I'm going to apply my standard kind of merchandising rules for this category. Well, what happens if I cluster it? Okay, I see sales go down, but still getting good opportunities. Days of supply, should I reduce it? Should I increase it? I've got labor challenges. I need to limit the churn, so only 15% of my category can churn. I've got a strategic question about shelf-ready packaging, and so now very quickly, right, teams can go run all these simulations and then come back and look at the data and say, okay, well, what is the right decision for our business? What is the right decision for our goals? So no longer kind of having to finger in the air, hope that my reduction of days of supply is going to have the impact. Let me go simulate it, and then I can refine that and iterate off of that. And there's really no limit to the number of scenarios you can run, right? It's just a matter of iterating through that process. And it goes back to that process. I need to shift more of this thinking earlier on so that the later stages of automation can really drive that efficiencies for us.
Yeah, I think this is where everyone is trying to get to, which is I need to do more time upfront thinking, optimizing, selecting against my strategy. If I could have all of these scenarios and I could read this, I would have a better sense of which one I want to commit to. And then if I could do all that up front and then know that my space planograms were going to be automated on the back end and I didn't have to build in 8 weeks for people to build a planogram or 6 weeks or whatever, and I could use this time up front, it would be not only decrease my cycle time, but probably make some better choices that I'm making today, which you try to get there, but there's not an easy way to do it with the tools we have today.
Even if it's just validating, right? Like, hey, here's the thing I want to do. Is that the right thing to do, right? We all have hypotheses and ideas about the business.
Sure.
So
yeah,
I'll wrap it up with this, and then I'd love for you to kind of close us out. But the technology's coming, right? We're getting more access to better and better tools, and it's about augmenting what we do, right? It's about the future of those individuals, those experts, being able to give them that co-pilot. That's what excites us so much about the future of this, right? It's finally recognizing that if I can't execute it, it's just an insight, it's just overhead. How do we help the people that drive the execution actually bring those things to life and really raise their voice and profile that? So we're really excited about it, and excited about the work that we're doing with our retail partners and suppliers, and eager to kind of continue to chart that future together. We'd love your closing perspective, and then we'll hand it to Jackie for Q&A.
Well, I think this is really exciting. It's a good way of painting kind of the art of the possible. And I think that that's what a lot of retailers are thinking about now. They're looking at the incredible pressure on their space planning team, their assortment planning team. They've got new data from their omni-channel sales to tell them they've got to get closer, as you call it, more localized. That survey earlier this year said store specific. That's what they're thinking about. And what I'm hearing is they can't get there with the tools they have today and the processes they have today. You just can't compress that anymore. And so what they're doing is thinking about, how do I re-engineer this whole process? And while I don't think that retailers are going to just be, they're smart, somewhat risk averse. They're not going to put all of their eggs in one basket. They're going to do probably a lot of different tests, some proof of concepts. They're going to try to figure this out. They've got little, skunk work teams working in little labs trying to figure out how they're going to do this. They're maybe taking a category manager or two and they're pulling them out and saying, let's try something completely different here during the next year and see how we get smarter about this, and then scale it out to the rest of the organization. So if I were to give advice to any of the retailers on the call, it would be that, you need to be thinking about where you need to be in 4 and 5 years from now. And you're just not probably going to be able to get there with your current tool set and your current process. So thinking about how can you test and learn very quickly is probably the right thing to do.
Yeah, I love that. Start small. You don't have to rechange the entire thing, right? Start small, learn together, and then evolve. What's
the chance that you're going to get it right out of the ball? You're going to hit a home run right as you walk up to plate. That's not going to happen. You need to figure it out. And what's right for one part of your business, your hard lines might not be right for your soft lines, might not be right for your perishables. So you need to kind of figure this out and figure out what works and how to roll it out to make money, to self-fund what else you need, because it's a never-ending appetite for retailers.
Well, awesome. Thank you again for joining us today, and appreciate the insight. Jackie, I will turn it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So exciting to see some of those specific use cases for space planning with AI and machine learning. Excited to hopefully hear some more too at our conference in February. So I know HIVERY is going to be a premier sponsor at our conference, February 27th through March 1st. With that, they will be presenting on a breakout presentation, hopefully maybe a case study. I know you're thinking about maybe bringing a client on board to dive deep into what some of this can achieve in some real life use cases, which will be great. And then as Flora mentioned, we do have the retail space planning charter is up and running. We've got actually another meeting, I think, later this afternoon. So we meet once a month. We've got subgroups going, creating content. It's really exciting. We'll also have a full track of content just on space planning at the conference as well. But if you want more information on how to join the space planning charter, what we've got going on, just go to spaceplanning.global and you can apply. So with that, we are actually running right up on time. How about one question from the audience? And then if there's any others that have been submitted, we'll have the folks from HIVERY follow up with you guys directly. How does that sound?
Perfect.
All right, so let's do this one. So there's more to do with space planning than resets in the store. How can retailers be more strategic in their space planning, and what role will technologies like AI play? I know you guys kind of covered some of this, but any additional color you want to provide the folks on the call?
So I love the comment. I guess that'd be my statement, is to think beyond just the reset process, right? Like to really start to think about space as an asset in data and in decision making, because that is the final mile, right? That is the final execution. And I think we have to elevate that in our processes all the way up front. And I think this is where the new tools and technologies allow us to do that. But I think we have to think differently about it. Today, it is just well, that's how I run the reset and that's how I bring it to life. This is where customers interact the most with our brands and with our stores. And I think it's really trying to bring that up in a bigger way. That to me is the big opportunity and shift.
Great.
Yeah, and I would say we've been really focused on micro space today, planograms, but there's a whole other level that probably AI could apply to in the big three for macro space, which is space allocation. How much space do you give those categories? Space location, where should it go in the store? And then space adjacencies. What should it be next to overall improve the market basket and help the customer get a full solution? So I think there's a lot more that AI could probably do to help not just work on these micro questions, but macro questions as well, because retailers are always working on what should their store of the future look like.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, thank you both so much for such great, valuable insights and conversation today. And we will see everyone after the holiday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackie. Thanks, Dirk.